I would say that one of the most important verses of the Quran for Muslims to take heed of at all times, especially during the month of Ramadan, is in Surah Al-Hadid. أَلَمْ يَأْنِ لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا أن تخشع قلوبهم لذكر الله وما نزل من الحق. Has not the time come for those who believe to soften their hearts or to humble their hearts to the remembrance of God and that which has descended from Al-Haq, God, the truth, the real. This is a fundamentally important thing that we often forget. There tends to be so much emphasis on memorizing the Quran, on reciting the Quran. But what about softening our hearts to the Quran and humbling our hearts to the Quran? What does it matter if you read the whole of the Quran, if you stand every night in Taraweeh and you've gone through the whole of the Quran? What does it matter if your heart is not softened to the Quran? What does it matter if you don't live in accord with that message? What does it matter if all of us are huffaz of the Quran, but none of us know how to live إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ اهْدِنَا الصِّرَاطَ الْمُسْتَقِيمَ? If we live that as a community and as individuals, we succeed. If we've memorized the Quran and we don't live the Fatiha, as communities and as individuals, we fail. To soften our hearts to the Quran, first look at the Sahaba. Now it's said that many of the Sahaba, they did not memorize more Quran until they had learned to live in accord with what they had already memorized. So it's really look at what we know and challenge ourselves. Say, am I actually living in accord with that? The Quran says, walk not exultantly upon the earth. Are we living in accord with that? These are the questions that we have to ask ourselves. They're penetrating questions. As, Umar ibn al-Khattab said, Hasib qablan tuhasab. That is, take account of yourself before you are taken account of. He didn't memorize the whole of the Quran. It's actually quite well known that he had difficulty memorizing the Quran. But that piece of advice is completely in accord with the Quran. And we have to do that process of taking account of ourselves and asking ourselves if we actually live in accord with this message. Only then is the Quran actually going to have any effect on us. What did Aisha say when she was asked about the nature of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? She said, "Kana khuluquhu al-Quran." His character traits were the Quran. That process of making the Quran our character traits is our challenge. That's, as Muslims, that's what we're supposed to do. But it means that we have to challenge ourselves and we have to really ask ourselves, both as individuals and as a community, whether or not we're doing it. Just memorizing the Quran is not doing it. Contemplating the Quran, the Quran asks us over and over and over again to contemplate it, to think about it, to understand it, so that we go through a process and realize it's not just about having iman, faith. It's also about having understanding. It's also about having insight. It's also about going through understanding, contemplation, and insight to that point where we can actually have yaqeen, certainty. But that's a lifelong process that involves challenging ourselves over and again and trying to live in accord with the Quran rather than just read the Quran.